The Alpha King gave her the coldest room in the heart of the estate. Her grandmother had told her once, stirring a pot of barley soup over a stove that barely worked. A fire doesn't beg a room to be warm. It simply burns, and the room has no choice but to change. Maren Voss had been 7 years old, sitting on a cracked wooden stool with her knees tucked to her chest, and she had not understood it then. She understood it now, at 23, with a single canvas bag over her shoulder and a letter of contract in her hand, standing at the iron gates of Ashvale Keep. The estate rose out of the Thornmere Valley like something that had grown there against the valley's will. Black stone towers, frost-rimmed windows, and ivy so old it had calcified against the walls. The sky above it was the color of pewter. The wind came off the northern ridge and found every gap in her coat at once. She was wolfless. She had no pack. She had no rank, no scent mark, no beast sleeping beneath her ribs. In the hierarchy of this world, she was the bottom rung of a ladder most people forgot was even a ladder. She had been hired as the estate's new housekeeper, not because she was the best candidate she suspected, but because she was the only one who had agreed to come. Ashvale Keep had been without a housekeeper for 3 years. The last 4 had quit within a season each. Maren reached into her coat pocket and touched the thing she always carried, a small river-smoothed stone, white as chalk, with a faint gray ring around its middle. Her grandmother had pressed it into her palm the morning she died, and said nothing at all. She didn't need to. The stone said it for her, every time Maren held it. A fire doesn't beg a room to be warm. She pushed open the gate and walked in. Chapter 1. The Welcome. The steward who met her at the door was a narrow man named Pell, with the kind of face that had forgotten how to arrange itself into anything warmer than neutrality. He was a shifted wolf, low-ranked, and he moved with the perpetual, slightly hunched posture of someone who had spent decades not making himself a target. He looked at her bag. He looked at her face. He looked at the contract letter. "You're smaller than I expected?" The position didn't list a height requirement. He almost smiled. He chose not to. He led her through an entrance hall that smelled of cold stone and old beeswax, and took her up 2 flights of stairs, past corridors she could already see needed attention. A tapestry pulling from its rod, a sconce with 3 dead candles, a windowsill thick with the gray dust of a northern winter. "The Alpha King is in residence," Pell said, in the tone of someone delivering a warning dressed as information. "He works in the East Wing. He eats at 7. He does not like noise before 9 in the morning." "What does he like?" Pell paused at a door. "I haven't worked that out in 4 years." He opened the door. The room was a tower room, circular, north-facing, with 2 narrow windows that looked directly into the path of the ridge wind. The hearth was there, technically. A small, mean thing, shallow-chested and soot-blackened. The stones around the window were laced with actual frost on the inside. The bed had 1 thin quilt and a pillow that had gone flat from disuse. The floor was bare. There was a single candle on the nightstand. It was, without question, the coldest room in the house. Pell set her key on the dresser. "Housekeeper's quarters? Meals are in the kitchen at staff hours. The Alpha King will not formally receive you until he chooses to." He paused at the door. "The last housekeeper lasted 6 weeks. She left a note that said only, 'Too cold. Good luck, Miss Voss.'" He left. Maren stood in the center of the circular room. Her breath came out in a small cloud. She set her bag on the flat pillow bed, reached into her coat pocket, and held the white stone for 1 long moment. Then she went to find the wood store. Chapter 2. The work begins. The estate had 12 occupied rooms, 43 rooms total, 6 fireplaces in regular use, and a kitchen that had been run by a cook named Sarah, a wide, warm-handed wolf woman who had outlasted every housekeeper by the simple strategy of minding her own fires, and no one else's business. Sarah looked at Maren the first morning the way you looked at something delicate near a cliff edge. "You want to start with the East Wing?" Sarah said it like a diagnosis. Is that where the worst of the neglect is? That's where he is. Marin tied her apron strings. Then yes. She did not start with the Alpha King's personal rooms. She was not reckless. She was strategic. She started with the east corridor outside his study, relaid the carpet runner that had buckled into a trip hazard, replaced the dead candles in the sconces with new ones, and polished the brass fittings until the corridor gave back warm gold light instead of dull gray. She found that the east wing's main chimney had a partially blocked flue. 5 years of swallow nests had collapsed into it. She spent an afternoon with a long-handled brush, her arms aching, until the draw cleared and she could feel the suction working properly again. The study door opened while she was on her knees sweeping ash from the hall fireplace. She had not expected to look up and find him there. She had expected, she wasn't sure. Something more dramatic, perhaps. A formal introduction. A summons. Instead, a tall figure in a dark gray work shirt, rolled to the elbows, holding a sheaf of papers, staring down at her with an expression that was not anger, but was its near neighbor. The Alpha King of the Thornmere territory was named Calder Ashvale, and he was exactly what the stories had suggested. Broad-shouldered, black-haired, going silver at the temples, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and then something had happened to it that had made it more interesting than handsome. A scar crossed his jaw. His eyes were the deep amber brown of a wolf in firelight, and they were, at this particular moment, regarding her the way one regarded an unexpected piece of furniture. "Who are you?" "Marin Voss, your new housekeeper. Pleased to meet you, Alpha King." He looked at the swept hearth. He looked at the lit sconce. He looked at her ash-gray hands. "The flue was blocked," she said. "I know. I had a fire set in that grate in December. It smoked out the entire corridor." "You should have sent for someone." Something moved through his expression too fast to name. "I did. They didn't come." He looked at her once more, a measuring look she had the impression he gave everything, assessing value, utility, threat. Then he went back into his study and shut the door. It was not a warm welcome. But it was not a dismissal either, and Marin had learned to note the difference. Chapter 3. The Coldest Room Begins to Change. She could not fix the tower room all at once. She had a household to restore to order first, and her evenings were short. But she approached her own quarters the way she approached every other problem, incrementally, with attention. The first week she found in the estate's storage cellar 3 rolled wool rugs no one had used in a decade. She dragged them up herself with Pell watching from the stairway landing, with an expression somewhere between admiring and appalled. She laid them on the tower room floor, and the cold retreated 3 inches upward from the stone. She fixed the chimney flue herself, same principle as the east wing, slightly different angle, and discovered the shallow little hearth could throw more heat than it appeared when you burned the right wood. She requisitioned oak split logs from the estate's wood store, and stacked them herself in the corner of the room. The first proper fire she lit in that hearth filled the round room with amber light, and the smell of smoke, and something older, earthier. She stood in front of it in her wool socks, and felt the room sigh. The second week, she found in the linen room a store of heavyweight curtains, deep red, slightly moth-eaten at the hems, but structurally sound. They had been taken down and folded away by some previous inhabitant who had apparently preferred the view over warmth. Marin hemmed the moth damage by candlelight, and rehung them. They cut the wind draft by 2/3 and turned the room's light in evenings from stark gray to something amber and enclosed. She put her grandmother's white stone on the windowsill, where it caught whatever pale morning light came through. She began to find, in the odd corners of the estate, things that needed homes as much as the room needed contents. A small bookshelf with a warped door. The door opened downward now and became a surface she could write at. A cracked earthenware pot that still held together well enough for a cutting of one of the kitchen herbs. A second candle. A small woven blanket in faded blue that smelled of lavender when she shook it out, some previous occupants leaving, kept in a trunk. By the end of the 3rd week, the circular tower room was warm. It was not elegant, but it was alive. What she had not anticipated was Calder Ashvale. He passed the tower staircase every evening on his way to the northern terrace, where Pell said he stood each night for 20 minutes, regardless of weather. Some wolf habit, Pell explained. Something about reading the territory's air. He had no reason to look up the staircase. He looked up the staircase. The first time, she assumed he was checking for a draft. The second time, she thought perhaps the firelight from her open door was visible at the staircase base, and he was assessing whether it was a hazard. The third time, he stopped entirely. She was sitting at her warped door desk, writing the week's supply order by the light of 2 candles and a healthy fire, and she heard his footstep pause on the stair below. She looked down. He was looking up. The amber of the firelight fell into the stairwell between them. He said nothing. He went on to the terrace. But the 4th evening he stopped and said, "It smells of oak fire. And is that rosemary? I have a cutting in an earthenware pot. The warm air from the chimney encourages it." He looked at the room behind her. She stepped back instinctively, not from fear, she realized, but from something that felt like the inverse of fear. And he looked in, saw the wool rugs, the red curtains, the stacked wood, the lit fire throwing shadows around the circular walls, the white stone on the sill catching the last of what light remained. This was the coldest room in the estate. He said it like a fact he was rechecking against new evidence. "It was," she said. He looked at her. "How?" "Oak wood, wool, attention." She paused. "A fire doesn't beg a room to be warm. It simply burns." She didn't mean to say that out loud. It had been her grandmother's saying, private property, not fit for alpha kings in dark corridors. But it was out now, and he was turning it over behind his amber eyes. He went to the terrace. She went back to her supply order. Chapter 4. The Thaw. She learned the house the way she learned everything, by touch, by repetition, by patience. She learned which windows were swollen shut in the damp and which opened freely. She learned that the dining room fire burned hot from the left side and cold from the right because one of the damper plates had warped. She learned that Sarah sang to herself when she was content and fell silent when something troubled her, and she learned to check on Sarah in her silences. She also learned Calder Ashvale, slowly and against his apparent wishes. He was not cruel. This surprised her, or rather, confirmed something she had guessed. The estate's reputation for cold came not from cruelty but from emptiness. He had let the house fall into disrepair not from contempt but from disengagement. Something in him had withdrawn, like a fire banked so low it gave no light and barely any heat, and everything had followed suit. His staff walked carefully around him, not because he struck them, but because he had gone so still that they no longer knew how to exist in his proximity. She did not walk carefully. She was not reckless about it. She was respectful. She was correct in her address. She observed the formal distance a wolfless woman in service ought to observe with an alpha king. But she did not mute herself, or shrink her footstep, or leave a room the moment he entered it, and gradually he seemed to notice the distinction. He began to appear in places she was working. Not hovering. He always had a reason. A document to retrieve, a window to check, a word for Pell who happened to be nearby. But he appeared. And he would, with the air of a man remarking on weather, say something. "You relaid the carpet in the east corridor." "It was a trip hazard. I tripped on it twice. 3 times by my count. The pile is flattened in 3 different impact patterns." A silence. Then, not quite a smile, but the structural precondition for one. "How do you notice things like that?" "I was taught to look." She smoothed the freshly polished sideboard. "Most things tell you what they need. You only have to pay attention." He stood in the doorway, and she could feel him looking. Not at the sideboard, not at the corridor, but at her. The quality of that attention was different from his usual assessment gaze. There was something uncertain in it, something that hadn't been there at the beginning. She had been warming the house for 6 weeks. The warmth, it seemed, was spreading. Chapter 5. The heart of it. The breakthrough, she would think of it as that later, happened in the 7th week. She had been working in the great hall, which had not been used in 2 years and showed every day of it. She'd been at it since morning, beating the dust from the curtains, scrubbing the stone floor on her hands and knees, rebuilding the enormous hearth fire from a bed of ash that must have accumulated since the last winter. It was late afternoon when she got the fire lit properly and stood back, her back aching and her hands raw, and watched the great hall come awake. It was extraordinary what fire did to that room. The stone walls, which had been a dead and oppressive gray, became amber. The old oak beams overhead went from dull to warm. The long dining table, which she had oiled and rubbed that morning, reflected the firelight in long amber streaks. The room, which had been a cavern, became, she felt the word land in her chest, a home. She didn't hear Calder come in. She heard his breath change. She turned. He stood at the far end of the hall, at the threshold, and he was looking at the room with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the assessment look, not the near neighbor of anger. Something unguarded, something that belonged to a younger version of him, something that had been packed away. "My mother used to light this room for winter gatherings," he said. He didn't say it to her exactly. He said it to the room. Marin said nothing. She picked up her scrub cloth and began folding it. "I haven't—" He stopped, tried again. "I haven't had this room lit since she passed. That was 5 years ago." "I'm sorry." She meant it plainly. He walked in slowly, the way you walked into a room you'd been away from for a long time and weren't certain would still have you. He stood by the fire and put his hands out toward it. Ordinary gesture, warming his hands, and yet there was something in it that felt like the most private thing she'd seen him do. "You did all of this today?" "Since this morning, yes." "Your hands." He'd seen the rawness. "You should have asked for help." "I had help scheduled for tomorrow. I wanted the fire tonight." He looked at her. "Why tonight?" She thought about it honestly. "The house felt like it was waiting. I didn't want to make it wait another day." Something in his face shifted, in a way she didn't have a word for yet. He looked back at the fire. "Pell says the staff speak differently since you came." He turned the information over. "He says the kitchen girl, Willa, laughed last week. He said he hadn't heard that in 2 years. Willa found a mouse in the flour tin. It was objectively funny. Marin? Her name. He used her name for the first time, and the sound of it was strange and clear, like a bell in a cold room. He looked directly at her. "What are you? You're not a wolf. You carry no rank. You came here with 1 bag, and you have done more to this house in 7 weeks than anyone has done in 5 years. A pause. "What do you want from it?" The question was genuine. She could hear the rawness in it, the alpha's habit of looking for motive, for leverage, for the cost. She answered without armor. "I want the house to be what a house should be. I want the people in it to be comfortable and warm, and to not dread the rooms they live in." She held his gaze. "I don't want anything from you, Alpha King. I want to do my work." He was quiet a long time. The fire spoke for both of them. "Then I'll leave you to it," he said. But he didn't leave immediately. He stood in his mother's great hall for a few more minutes, in the warmth she'd rebuilt for it, and Marin let him have that without comment. When he finally went, she sat on the hearthstone and let her back unclench, and her hands stop aching, and her chest fill with something that felt, dangerously, like contentment. Chapter 6. The Contest of Wills. Not everyone was warming. The estate had a visiting presence that Marin had not been adequately warned about. A woman named Duchess Soulweaver, who arrived in the 8th week with 3 attendants, a carriage of luggage, and the settled confidence of someone who believed themselves on the cusp of something they'd been arranging for a long time. She was an alpha herself, a rare thing, rare and formidable, and she smelled to every wolf in the estate like authority. She looked at Marin across the entrance hall on her first morning and said loudly to the room in general, "The wolfless housekeeper! How very unusual! And progressive, I suppose, in a quaint way. Marin straightened the Duchess's guest room fire and said nothing. Sylvain was not unkind in any gross way. She didn't threaten Marin or demean her openly. She did something more surgical. She spoke about her as though she were furniture, discussing the household arrangements in Marin's presence as if Marin were not present. She redirected the staff's small loyalties, suggesting to Pell that the East Wing carpet choice was his idea, and that she'd helped him along to it, suggesting to Sarah that some of the kitchen improvements were obvious and anyone would have done them. She wanted Calder. This was obvious. She moved through the estate like a woman measuring it for herself, touching its restored walls and warm-lit corridors with an appraising eye, and looking at Calder with calculated warmth. What Marin watched, quietly, from her usual position of near invisibility, was Calder watching the Duchess perform the estate's warmth without seeming to understand that she hadn't made it. He was not stupid. But he had not been watching it happen. He had been inside it, day by day, letting it change around him without always clocking who was doing the changing. The breaking point came at dinner on the third night of Sylvain's visit, when the Duchess, gesturing expansively at the lit great hall, said, "You've done well to restore this room, Calder. It shows real intention." As though the intention were his. Marin was at the sideboard. She did not react. Calder did. "I didn't restore it." His voice was even, but there was an edge in it she recognized, the edge of a fact being defended. "Miss Voss restored it, in a single day, on her hands and knees." Silence at the table. Sylvain's smile adjusted almost imperceptibly. "Of course, one's staff." "She is not one's staff as a category. She is Marin Voss, who came here with one bag, and has, in 8 weeks, made this house livable again." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "She noticed things I hadn't noticed in 5 years. She fixed them without being asked. She lit a fire in a room I'd let go dark, and I found myself—" He stopped, picked back up. "She deserves to have her name used and her work named." Marin kept her face very still. She put the breadbasket on the table. Her hands were perfectly steady. The Duchess recalibrated. The evening continued. But something had shifted in the room's architecture. Something that Marin felt in her solar plexus and chose not to examine until she was back in her warm tower room, alone, with the fire going and the white stone on the windowsill and her knees tucked to her chest on the wool rug floor, remembering what it felt like to be named out loud by someone who did not have to name her. Chapter 7. Recognition. The Duchess left on the 5th day. Calder appeared at Marin's tower room doorway the evening after, which was the first time he'd come to the door rather than simply pausing at the stairwell below. He knocked. She found that remarkable. An alpha king, knocking at the housekeeper's door. She opened it. He was holding something. A folded piece of paper. "I amended your contract," he said. "The terms were inadequate. The pay, the hours, the room assignment." He looked at the room behind her. The rugs, the red curtains, the rosemary cutting in the earthenware pot, the fire. "I should have given you better quarters. I like this room." She meant it completely. He looked at her steadily. "Pell could not understand that. He thought you'd complain. It was cold. I warmed it." She paused. "That's the work. Not just the assigned rooms. All of them, including this one." He held out the amended contract. She took it, unfolded it, read it. The pay was nearly doubled. There was a line formally designating the tower room as housekeeper's permanent quarters, at occupant's preference. There was another line she had to read twice. A new title. Head of household. Not housekeeper. Something with more weight. "I don't have a wolf," she said. It felt necessary to name it. "I have no rank. In your territory, I don't register in the hierarchy." "My hierarchy has been a cold and badly maintained thing," he said, "and you have done more for this estate without a wolf than most ranked wolves have done with one. His jaw was set, the way it's set when he was saying something true that cost him something to say. Rank is a designation. I'm watching what you actually do. She looked at the contract. She looked at him. There's another matter, he said. His voice had changed, gone quieter and more careful in the way voices went quiet when they were carrying something heavier than logistics. I have been thinking for several weeks about what kind of man lets his house fall cold while the people in it grow cold with it. What kind of man loses his mother and responds by letting the fires go out rather than learning to tend them himself. A pause. I have been thinking that you came here with one bag, and you built warmth out of nothing, and I cannot... He stopped again. The scar on his jaw moved. I cannot keep pretending I don't notice you, Maren. Not in a professional capacity only. The fire behind her spoke in pops and settle sounds. She had known this was building. She had felt it in every paused footstep on the staircase, every moment he lingered in a room she was working in, every time he had used her name like it meant something specific to him. She was wolfless. He was an alpha king. The social architecture of their world put an enormous, cold, drafty distance between them, and she had not come here to find a way around that architecture. She had come to do her work, but she also knew, her grandmother had taught her, that a fire didn't beg the room. She simply said, I notice you too. It was the truest version of the thing. No performance, no qualification. Just the fact of it, laid plain. He crossed the threshold of her warm tower room, and in the amber firelight, with the rosemary scenting the air and the wool rugs under their feet and the white stone on the windowsill, he cupped her face in both hands and kissed her with the gentleness of a man who had been cold for a long time, and understood now what warmth cost. The fire burned. The room had no choice but to change. Chapter 8. What was built? The rest came in increments, which was how all real things came. There were conversations that lasted past midnight, both of them in the chairs she'd placed by the tower fire, with tea going cold between them because they forgot to drink it. She learned about his mother, Alden, who had lit candles in every dark corner of this estate, and whose death had extinguished something essential in him. He learned about her grandmother and the barley soup, and the saying that had followed Maren into every cold room she'd ever entered. He learned about what it meant to be wolfless, in a world that organized itself around wolves, not the self-pity version, which she did not traffic in, but the exact mechanics of it. What doors were closed, what registers you didn't appear in, what it cost to be underestimated so consistently that you stopped noticing it was happening, and simply built your life in the gaps. The gaps are where I do my best work, she told him once, dry as tinder. He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, and it changed his face entirely, and she put the sound of it away carefully, like a stone in a pocket. He told the territory formally, through the council, through the proper announcements, that Maren Voss had been designated head of household at Ashvale Keep, and that she held his explicit confidence. This was not a romantic declaration. It was a structural one, and in some ways more powerful. It meant that when she walked the estate answered to her. Staff who'd been hedging their cooperation gave it cleanly. Suppliers who'd been slow to fulfill orders found their correspondence answered promptly. He told her his feelings more privately, in the tower room, in gradual accumulations of words in proximity and shared firelight, and she received them the same way she'd received the room, not by being overwhelmed, but by knowing exactly what to do with them. She also did not stop working. This was important to her. The warmth of the estate was not the byproduct of a romance. It had come first, from her hands and her attention, and she would not let it become retroactively dependent on his regard. She kept the fires. She kept the floors. She trained Willa, who was quick and observant, in how to read a room for what it needed. She began slowly, with Calder's agreement, to open the estate's restored rooms for the territory's community, a gathering at Harvest End, a winter market in the grounds, a space offered to the pack healers for their quarterly assessments. Ashvale Keep, which had been a cold and looming thing in the valley's imagination for 5 years, became something else. People began to speak of it the way you spoke of places that held warmth. The way her grandmother's kitchen had held warmth, despite the broken stove and the cracked stool and the bowls of barley soup that were more water than barley. A fire doesn't beg a room to be warm. Epilogue. 1 year later. It was the first morning of winter, and the great hall was lit from end to end. Not by Marin alone this time. Willa had done the hearth before breakfast, correctly and efficiently, and the kitchen had sent up warming spices for the mulled cider that was set out on the sideboard for the staff and the arrivals from the territory. The estate's healer, a quietly competent woman named Tose, was setting up her corner for the day's assessments. Pell was at the door with his narrow, now almost welcoming face, ticking names off a list. Marin stood at the center of the great hall in her good dress, not her working clothes for once, and watched it run without her having to direct every breath of it. That was the sign, she thought. Not the restored curtains, or the polished brass, or the cleared flue, or any individual thing. The sign that a house was truly warm was when the warmth reproduced itself, when other people carried it forward without being told. Calder came to stand beside her. He was in his formal estate colors, dark gray and bronze, and he smelled of cold morning air from his terrace, which she now often shared with him, the two of them watching the valley breathe in the pre-dawn dark. He said nothing, only looked at the room with her. After a moment, "My mother would have liked you." "You've said that before?" "I'll probably keep saying it." A pause. "She used to say there were people who walked into rooms and took the warmth out, and people who walked in and made it." His voice was careful with the memory. "I think she was trying to tell me to choose carefully." Marin reached into her dress pocket and closed her fingers around the white stone. Smooth, river-worn, chalk-pale, with its faint gray ring, her grandmother's last gift. She had carried it to every cold room, every drafty corridor, every hearth she'd rebuilt from cold ash. It was warm from her body now, the way stones became warm when they were held enough. She drew it out and placed it, deliberately, on the mantelpiece of the great hall's hearth. Not in her room anymore. Here, at the center of the thing she'd built, the place the whole estate moved around, the room she'd scrubbed on her hands and knees and filled with firelight while a grieving Alpha King stood in the threshold and remembered his mother's warmth. Calder looked at the stone. He knew what it was. She had told him about it in one of their past midnight conversations, and he had listened the way he'd learned to listen, with his full attention, like someone reading a document he intended to honor. "You're leaving it there," he said. "It belongs in the heart of things." She looked at the room, Willa at the hearth, Pell at the door, Tossie at her corner, the cider steaming, the fire burning, the territory's people beginning to fill the space. "It's warm enough in my room that I don't need to hold it anymore." He took her hand. She let him. A fire doesn't beg a room to be warm. It simply burns, and the room has no choice but to change. She had been given the coldest room in the house. She had made it the warmest, and then, because warmth was not a thing you hoarded, she had let it spread, room by room, floor by floor, stone by stone, until the whole estate breathed with it, and a valley that had looked up at dark windows for 5 years found them lit, and took that light for granted, the way you took for granted any good thing that had been in place long enough to feel permanent. That, her grandmother would have said, was the whole point. Marin Voss, wolfless, unranked, who had arrived with one bag and a river-smoothed stone and a saying she'd borrowed from a woman who stirred barley soup over a broken stove. Marin stood in the heart of what she'd built, and was warm, and let herself be seen. End.